Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this session we're going to teach you all about using gauges in Microsoft SQL Server reporting services. We'll start by showing you the basics of working with gauges, including how to add one to a table, talk to you about scales, ranges and pointers, the various component parts that go into building up a gauge, and then how you can link a pointer to a field in a dataset. When we've covered that, we'll move on and show you all the various ways that you can modify gauges. So we'll show you how to edit and format a gauge, including how to add conditional formatting. We'll talk to you about how to add extra items to a gauge, and then how to modify those. And finally, how to position items in a gauge, which is one of the most tricky things you'll do in reporting services. So let's get started. In reporting services, a gauge is really just a completely over-the-top way of displaying a set of numbers. In this example, we've got a radial gauge, which displays a film's Oscar nominations against its Oscar wins. On the scale, there's either a green line or a red line, which indicates how many Oscars a film was nominated for. And the pointer, either green or orange, indicates how many Oscars that film won. The scale and the pointer turn green when the number of nominations is met by the number of Oscar wins. So further down the list, where films haven't won as many Oscars as they were nominated for, the scale is red and the pointer is orange. In another example, we've got a linear gauge, and this one's designed to show us how long a film lasts in minutes. It's a very straightforward, basic bar graph. The pointer this time, there are actually two pointers in this example, but they're designed to change colour based on hitting certain thresholds. So where a film is less than 100 minutes long, it's a green pointer, where it's between 100 and 150 minutes, it's an orange one, and then any more than 150 is a red pointer. And we're going to show you how to create both those two types of gauges in this video. So for our first example, we're going to show you how to create that radial gauge, which compares Oscar nominations against Oscar wins. We've already set up the basic table to include all the data. The next step is to add a gauge to this blank cell in the table. We're going to do that by using the toolbox, and you'll find the gauge tool sitting down towards the bottom of the list, and all we're going to do is drag a gauge into that blank cell in the table. When you release the mouse button, you'll be provided with a list of options. These are all the various gauges you can select from. We're going to go with the basic standard radial gauge, and I'm going to choose OK. And then the next thing you'll almost certainly want to do is to increase the width of the column and definitely the height of the row, so that we can actually see and work on the gauge a little bit more easily. Once you've inserted the gauge into the table, the next step is to choose which field the pointer will indicate. So I'd like my orange arrow here to point to the film's Oscar wins value. To do that, I need to select the cell containing the gauge, and then I need to click once again to select the gauge itself. That will expose the gauge data panel, and I'll get a list on here of all of the pointers. A gauge can have more than one pointer. Here we only have one, and where it says unspecified, I'm going to select which field I'd like that pointer to indicate. Clicking on the drop down arrow, I can choose film Oscar wins. It will always attempt to aggregate that field, so by default for numerical data it will try to sum the field. We can modify that later if we need to. But at this point, if I simply preview the report, I should be able to see that the pointer is pointing at the Oscar wins value. The next step now is to control all of the other things that I can modify about this gauge, which is quite a lot of effort. The first thing that I'd like to modify about my gauge is this little red line area, which is referred to as a range. A range is used to indicate an important part on the scale of a gauge. I'd like mine to run from 0 to the same value as the Oscar nominations field. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the design view, and then I need to select the part of the gauge that I'd like to change. You can see at the moment that I've got the pointer selected. It has this little border all the way around the outside of the orange arrow. To select the range, I simply need to click on it. When I've selected the object, I can right click and then find the option that refers to its properties. When I click this option, I'll see the properties dialog box. Now for a range on the General tab, I can choose what value the range starts at. I'm going to start it at 0. I'm going to end it at the value of one of my fields. I can do that either using the expression builder with the FX button, or I can simply select from the drop-down list sum of film Oscar nominations. Again, a Gage always tries to aggregate numerical data. Because we're looking at a single row at a time, the aggregate isn't important. We can just select that option and it will show the appropriate value for each record. If I choose OK, and then I preview the report again, for some of our records it's a little bit tricky to see the information, but you can just about make out the end of the range sitting below the pointer. If I scroll into a different page, there we go, we can see the range sitting between the value of 0 and the Oscar nominations. It's a bit disappointing that the range is kind of obscured by our pointer in most of the records. So what we're going to do to tidy that up is we're going to change the position of the range so that it sits on top of the scale. I'm also going to make sure that it doesn't increase in width as it gets further around the scale. So to do that, we need to go back to the design view, and making sure that the range is selected, right-click on it and choose to view its properties again. We can change all of these options from the General tab. So at the moment, the range is placed inside the scale at a distance of 30% from it. I'm going to make sure that the range sits on top of the scale, so I'm using the option called Cross. And I like the distance from the scale to be 0. I'm also going to make sure that it's slightly narrower than it is at the moment, so I'm going to change its start width from 15 to 10%, and I'm going to make sure that it doesn't increase in width as it goes around, so I'm going to make sure its end width is the same as the start, 10%. If I click OK, you can see the preview already shifts to indicate the basics, the basic preview. But if I actually want to see how the data is represented, I need to go back to the preview itself. And I can see now that I can clearly see the range for every film. Another thing that will really help us to see the range and the value that the pointer is indicating is if we change the scale. So instead of going from 0 to 100, we can go from 0 to a much smaller value, say 20 for instance. To change that, I need to go back to the design view, and I need to make sure that I have the scale selected. If I click onto the scale or onto one of the numbers, I can see now that the border is around the scale. If I right click then, I should be able to view the scale properties. It's a similar dialog box to the range properties in that I get a General tab and various other tabs. But here I can change the minimum and maximum value of the scale. If I change it to 20 and then choose OK, and preview the results, I can see that I get a much shorter scale, which makes it much easier to see what values my pointer is indicating. Another useful thing that I can do with the scale is control how often the digits appear around it. So by default they're being shown every 2 digits. I'd like them to appear every 1 in this example. I can head back to the design view, making sure I have the scale selected, right click on it and choose Scale Properties. On the General tab, there's an option called Interval, which is set to Auto. If I want my digits to appear for every value of 1, I simply type in the number 1. Click OK, and then preview the report one more time, and I'll now see I get the value for every whole number from 0 to 20. There are lots and lots of options available for modifying the way the pointer appears. The main one that I'd like to show you is how to control the colour in a conditional way. So I'd like the arrow to change colour from orange to green if a film wins the same number of Oscars as it was nominated for. So to do that, I can head back to the design view, select the pointer, right click on it, and then choose Pointer Properties. Now the Pointer Options tab itself has lots and lots of options available, including the ability to change the type of pointer and then change the style, just to quickly show you the sheer number of options available. Every one of those has an option for changing the size and position of it, but what we're really interested in is the pointer fill. If I select that tab, I can see that at the moment the pointer is shaded using a gradient pattern from white to orange. What I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate the secondary colour here by clicking the FX button. I'm going to delete what's in the expression builder dialog box so far. If you've seen some of our previous videos, you'll be very familiar with the expression builder dialog box by now. We're going to use from the common functions category, the program flow section. We're going to use the good old favourite if function. If I double click if, it will type in the syntax of that function for me. What I'd then like to do is compare whether or not the film's Oscar nominations is the same as the wins. I can do that, I can insert the fields at least, using the fields category here. If I double click one of my two Oscar fields, film Oscar nominations, wins, I can then type in an equals sign, and then double click the other Oscar field, this time nominations. So I'm comparing if the Oscar wins is the same as the nominations. I can type in a comma at that point, and all I need to do now is select which colour I want to use. I can do that from the constants category. I'm going to select this lime green colour just by clicking on it. Then I can type in another comma, and the colour that I'd like the pointer to be if the wins is not the same as the nominations, I'll go back to using that standard orange colour. If I close the round brackets at that stage, and then choose OK, choose OK again. Now in the design view, the pointer will appear to have no colour or just a pale grey colour. If I go back to a preview, however, the colour should be calculated correctly for each record. So Jurassic Park has the same wins as nominations, it has a green arrow. Spider-Man doesn't meet the nominations, so it has an orange arrow. For the next example, we're going to use a different type of gauge to show the film's running time in minutes. So we already have the basic outline of the table set up. What we're going to do next is drop a gauge from the toolbox into the next blank table cell. This time I'm going to choose a linear gauge, and I'm going to use the one called bullet graph. If I select it and then click OK, I'll also need then to increase the width of the column and the height of the row so we can see the gauge a bit more clearly. So you can see it's quite different to the original radial gauge, but it's still composed of the same pieces, if you like. There's an outer gauge panel, there is a pointer, the orange bar. Actually, there are two pointers in this example. There's the orange bar and the orange line. There's a scale, which in this case is shown as a percentage, and there are several ranges as well, the dark grey, middle grey and light grey areas. So although this gauge looks quite different to the original one, it's still composed of the same parts, and it's still treated and modified in the same way. So the first thing that I want to do is make sure that the pointers are pointing to the correct value. So I need to do that by selecting the gauge and then selecting again the pointer within it. The gauge data panel appears, and it shows me here actually that there are two different objects or two different pointers associated with this gauge. I'm going to set both of them to refer to the film runtime in minutes field. So you can see that linear pointer 1, when that's selected, refers to the bar. If I select linear pointer 2, it shows me that that's the orange line. I'm going to set this one to refer to the film's running time in minutes as well. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure the scale is big enough to display the total value of the film's running time in minutes. So I'm going to do that by selecting the scale, right-clicking on it, and choosing Scale Properties. On the dialog box, I'm going to set the minimum from 0 to 0 and the maximum to 250. I'm also going to make sure that the gauge, the numbers aren't formatted as a percentage. So in order to do that, I can head to the Number tab, and instead of using a custom percentage symbol, I'm going to go for the default format, which will just display the numbers as numbers. If I then select OK and then have a look at the preview, I'll be able to see already that my gauge is showing the correct values. One small downside of having extended the scale of my gauge is that the ranges no longer extend all the way to the end. So what I'm going to do is add a couple of extra ranges and also modify where the existing ones sit. I'd like one range to appear for every set of 50 units on the scale. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the design view, and I'm going to start by adding in an extra range. To add anything to an existing gauge, you need to select the cell containing the gauge and then again the gauge panel itself. make sure the gauge data panel appears next to the gauge, next to the table cell. If I right click then into the background of the gauge, I see a list of all of the items that I can add to this existing gauge. I can add an extra scale if I wanted to, another pointer or 3, the one that I'm going to choose in a moment, which is another range, but I can also add things like an extra gauge within this one, so I can embed one gauge within another. Things get rapidly quite messy if you do things like this. So I'm going to stick with a fairly simple example and simply choose to add a range. Now that I've added the range, I need to modify its properties so that it sits in the appropriate place. So you can see that at the moment it's sitting actually slightly above the scale, whereas the other ones are sitting on top of it. And obviously it's in the wrong position. I want to shift it so that it sits right at the end between 200 and 250 units. To modify those things, I need to right click and then modify the range properties. I can set its starting point at the value of 200, and I can set its end point at 250. I also want to make sure that its placement isn't inside the scale, it's actually outside, it's actually crossing the scale, so it'll sit in line with the other ranges that are already there. Finally, I'm simply going to change the fill colour so that it has a solid fill, which is actually quite a light colour. I'm going for white, in fact. If I choose OK, I'll now see that that range sits right at the end between 200 and 250. All I need to do now is modify the other existing ranges by right-clicking on them and choosing to modify their properties. So I'll start each one setting spanning a set of 50 units, and again for the next one. And finally I'll make the final one span 100 units, 0 to 100, so it fills up the entire bar. If I look at the preview now, I see quite a nice effect where each set of 50 units is divided in a different colour. Just like with the radial pointer from earlier on, we can apply conditional formatting to this gauge so that we can see the sort of ranges of numbers that are indicated. I'm going to change it so that the pointer, the orange bar and the orange line, is in green if the film running time in minutes is less than 100, and then it will be orange if it's between 100 and 150, and any more than that it'll turn red. So to do that, we're going to head back to the design view, and I need to make sure that I've selected the orange bar part of the gauge. So if I select, if I can, there we go. The pointer one, a slightly easier way to do it would have been to actually select it from the gauge data panel. I can then right click onto the bar and choose pointer properties. I'm going to head to the pointer fill tab, and then I'm going to change the secondary colour from orange. I'm going to use an expression to build this, so I click the FX button to launch the expression builder. I'm going to remove whatever's in there at the moment, and then I'm going to use the function called switch. So I'll find it in the common functions list in the program flow category, and I can double click the switch function to type in the basic syntax. All I need to do now is write pairs of arguments, which will be a logical test, and then what colour I want to achieve if that logical test returns true. So each test will be of this form. I'm going to check, first of all, if the film runtime minutes is less than 100, then a comma, and if that's true, I'd like the colour to be green, so I can select that from the constants category here. If I type in another comma, I can check if the film runtime minutes is less than 150, followed by a comma, and if that's true, I want to show orange. Finally, for anything else, I can simply type in the word true, followed by another comma, and then the colour I'd like those films to be. So basically anything that's 150 minutes or more. If I close around brackets, because I'd like to make sure that this condition also applies to the second pointer, I'm going to copy this to the clipboard at this point. If I then select OK and OK again, you'll see that the pointer turns grey on this design view, but it will generate the right colour in preview. I'm quickly going to select the linear pointer 2 as well. I'll do it the sensible way this time by selecting it from the gauge data panel, and I can also launch its properties using this little button in the top left hand corner. If I go to the pointer fill tab, find the FX button next to the secondary colour, and then replace whatever's in the dialog box so far with what I had copied to the clipboard earlier on. Select OK, select OK again. I'm going to make the row a little less tall so that we can hopefully see more gauges in one screen. And if I preview the report at this point, there we go. I ought to see a nice combination of films with different grades of running times. And one more thing that I can add to my gauge is called a label. And as you'd expect, it allows me to add descriptive text to the gauge itself. I'm going to add two to my gauge, one that will sit roughly in the top left-hand corner, which displays the film's name, and another one towards the top right-hand corner, which shows the film's running time in minutes. This is one of the most fiddly, awkward things you can actually do with a gauge, particularly when you're trying to get your labels positioned accurately. So if I head back to the design view, I'm going to increase the height of my row to make it a little bit clearer to see, maybe the width of the column as well. And what I need to make sure I've done is selected the gauge itself. If I click onto the gauge and then once again to select the gauge itself, make sure the gauge data panel appears. I can right click into the background and choose to add a label. Now first of all I'm going to move the label so that it sits in the top left hand corner of the gauge itself. If I right click onto this label, I can choose to view its properties. And there's several options that you'll need to consider when you're positioning a label. The anchor option basically specifies which object within this cell in the table the label takes its cues from to be positioned. So it says it's taking its cues from linear gauge 1. As this gauge actually fills up the entire table cell, there will be no difference between choosing that option and the only other available option there, which is called none. Then the positioning of the label itself is taken using a percentage. So there's a top value which specifies how far from the top of the anchored option, so how far from the top of the gauge is the top of the text box. If I change this to a value of 0, you can see that the text box jumps right up to the very top of the gauge panel. I actually want it a little bit further down from there, so I'm going to change it to say, let's say 10%. 10%, and that fits slightly more neatly into the gauge panel itself. Then there's a left property, which again works in a very similar way. It's the distance, the percentage distance from the left-hand edge of the gauge to the left-hand edge of the label. I'm going to change that to something like 5. Then I can modify the width and the height of the label in exactly the same way. I'm going to increase the height slightly to say 15%, and I'm going to change the width to 50. So that should give me enough space to display the film's title. To actually set the title, I can modify the text property here. If I use the FX button to launch the expression builder, I can replace the word text with a reference to the film name field. If I then click OK, that will display the film name field in the text box. One final thing that I'm going to do is just quickly check the font size property. So on the font tab, by default, text in a text box or a label is set to auto size. So the longer the film name, the smaller the text will become. Now that can be quite useful in certain situations, but I'd like to fix my font size to a particular size. So I'm going to uncheck this box and then change the font size to 10 points. If I then click OK and preview my report, I should be able to see that the film's name appears in the top left-hand corner for each gauge. So there's one more label that I'd like to add, and that's one that will display the film's running time in minutes at the top right-hand corner. So I'm going to go back to the design view and select the gauge, and then right-click into the background of the gauge and choose to add another label. This time a lot of the properties have been changed for me already, so you can see that the position where the next label sits is different to where the original one appeared, which was in the middle of the gauge. I'm going to right click onto this label and choose to view its properties. I'm going to make sure that its positioning is accurate first of all, so I'm going to change its top property so that it sits 10% down from the top of the gauge, just as the previous label does. I'm going to change its left property so that it begins 75% of the way from the left-hand edge of the gauge. Finally, I'm going to change the width property so that it's 20% of the width. This will make sure if I start 75% from the left-hand edge and the label fills 20% of the width, it means that the right-hand edge of this label is 5% from the right-hand edge of the gauge. I'm going to modify the text next, so that I click the FX button to launch the expression builder, and I'll replace the word text with a reference to the film runtime minutes field. And I'm also going to join on or concatenate to the end of that the word minutes, so I can use the ampersand symbol, and then in a set of double quotes I can type in the word minutes. I've deliberately left a space just before the word minutes there. If I choose OK, I shall quickly check that the font is set to the appropriate size, so it's not being auto resized. It's set to a size of 10 points. And I can also just quickly switch back to the General tab, and I'm going to make sure that the text is aligned to the right of the text box. If I choose OK, I can then delete these two columns completely from the gauge, so from the table. I mean, I can increase the width of that cell, maybe decrease the height ever so slightly, and then preview the report to see the effects. There we go. A useful gauge with dynamic colouring and useful labels to display numerical information graphically. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.